This has been a crazy week in New York City for charter school events, and there seem to have been at least 2 a day since Monday. I've been at a couple myself, but I think this will be the most thoughtful, not that I'm biased. The pleasure is doubled, I think, by the opportunity to have a thoughtful, substantive conversation about difficult questions regarding charter schools. This is not going to be one of those slanging matches, and it's not about yes or no. This is about an important sector of public education that has been growing, that is controversial, and that, like all public sector education, could be better than it is, and has given a great variety of results to date. We're particularly pleased to have Richard Kahlenberg and Halley Potter here because, as you know, they've just produced a new book, which will be available for signing afterwards. I've actually read it, which for a dean and a director institute is actually quite a rare event. My wife was saying, when was the last time you actually read a book from cover to cover? It's actually a healthy experience. I recommend it. The daunting point about reading this book is that almost every paragraph has at least 4 footnotes. And that reminds me of the kind of quality of scholarship that we need in the field. And it allows for critics, frankly, to engage seriously rather than in some trivial way with gotcha or you missed a fact. So it's been a pleasure to read that book. I congratulate both of you on it. I'm not going to go through bios because nothing as boring as having the person up here read what you can read on the back, simply to say that these are distinguished scholars holding distinguished posts. And the way this will work is that we will hear from our guests for about 20-25 minutes. After 25 minutes, I will start making angry signals. Then we will have a distinguished respondent, who I will introduce at that point, and then bring all of us up to the table for question answer. And then, as is our habit here, we will, of course, open it up to the floor for discussion. So without more ado, please welcome our guests.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, David, for your kind comments and for hosting this forum, and thank you, Gerard, whom you all will meet in a moment, for participating in this. We've gone back and forth on a number of different occasions, and I've always enjoyed the experience. And I want to thank my co-author, Halley Potter, whom you will hear from in a moment as well. This has been a wonderful collaboration on a smarter charter. We have broken down our responsibilities very clearly. I am the bad cop. I will talk about the original vision for charter schools, which came from Al Shanker, how I think the charter school movement moved away from that positive idea. And then Halley will come up and give you all the good news about a few charter schools that are representing that really exciting original vision that Al Shanker articulated a number of years ago. So we will start with that. Let's see. Here we go. There's a nice picture of Al Shanker. I wrote a biography of Al Shanker in 2007 called Tough Liberal. And for a New York audience, usually you don't need much explanation, but he was called the George Washington of teachers because he brought collective bargaining, along with others, to New York City in the early 1960s, but was at the same time a very innovative education reformer who had 52 ideas a year that he articulated in a column that some of you may remember called Where We Stand in the New York Times. It was a paid column, but it was done so well that people thought it was part of the newspaper editorial content and would write letters to the editor in response to this advertisement. So in 1988, Al Shanker first articulated the idea of charter schools. Ray Budde before him had talked about the charter school concept, but Shanker was really the one who got it started. And he had a vision that charter schools would be places that would be laboratories for innovation, that they would improve the public schools. The public schools would learn the lessons from this small set of charter schools. And there were two principal themes that ran through his first speech where he articulated the charter school idea. And it was based on a visit that he'd had with a German school in Cologne, where there were really two aspects that struck him. The first was that teachers should have a lot of say in this new type of charter schools, that they ought to be able to tap into their expertise in order to try out some innovative ideas. And the second piece was that the schools should be racially and economically integrated. The Cologne school he visited had Turkish immigrant students sitting next to German native students, and all students benefited from that. So those were the two principal themes. Then the Shanker concept began to be implemented first in Minnesota, where a young legislator, Ember Reichgott-Young, that wasn't meant to be a pun, but she articulated the idea of charter schools as a place where teachers would be empowered. She saw that charter schools the traditional public schools had high levels of teacher turnover. She was concerned about that. And so charter schools would be a place where teachers would be empowered and where they would be invested and they would feel like they had a reason to stay. Also in Minnesota, we saw a private group that was pushing charter schools and really saw the opportunity for integration by race and class. So charter schools, because they are not bound by neighborhood, do not have to reflect the racial and economic segregation patterns in housing. And so there was this really unique opportunity through public school choice to bring kids of different backgrounds together. And so that's what the Citizens League thought would make sense. Now, as it turns out, this original vision for charter schools was backed by an enormous body of research. Benefits of teacher voice were well established, and the benefits of school integration were well established. So today, teacher unions, which are the primary vehicle for teacher voice, are highly controversial, often scapegoated as the reason that our public schools are not doing well. But if you go back and look at the careful research on this issue, a majority of the studies find that teacher union representation actually can enhance learning in schooling, and only a minority of studies find a negative effect. And the highest quality studies also tend to find a positive effect for teacher voice and unionization. Well, why is that true? Leo Casey, with the Albert Shanker Institute, I think summed it up very nicely when he said, working conditions of teachers are the learning conditions for students. So when teachers push for better working conditions, for smaller class size, for adequate salaries so that better quality teachers can be attracted to the profession, this is likely to be good for kids. And I'm sure we'll get into a more nuanced discussion of this, but one can make an argument that giving teachers voice will improve education for kids. Richard Ingersoll from the University of Pennsylvania has also done a lot of research on teacher input into education and has found that when teachers feel that they have control over what's going on in a school, they are much more likely to stay, which is in turn associated with positive outcomes for kids because of the continuity in teaching. On the question of integration, there is a half century of research to suggest that avoiding concentrations of poverty in schooling is an important goal for improving educational achievement for students. In the press, we hear a lot about those high-poverty schools that work because they're encouraging stories and they are attractive for the press for that reason. But if you look at the data more carefully, it turns out that they are really the outlier. That if you look at schools that are consistently high-performing over time in more than one subject, that middle-class schools, those with more than 50% of students who are not eligible for subsidized lunch, are about 22 times as likely to be high-performing as high-poverty schools, those with the majority of low-income students. So those are not great odds if you're trying to improve, if you're putting all your eggs in the basket of improving high-poverty schools. Well, critics will rightly point out that part of the reason that high-poverty schools do not do well is that low-income students, on average, come to school with greater needs, less chance for learning in those early years. And so it may just be that this is all a family effect rather than a school effect. But if you try to separate out the two questions, family and schooling, the school concentrations of poverty, you find that when you give low-income students a chance to go to more affluent schools, lower poverty schools, they will perform on average quite a bit better than low-income kids who are stuck in high poverty schools. So the top line here, this is the fourth grade National Assessment for Educational Progress in Math, and the top line is the students who are not eligible for free and reduced price lunch, so making more than 185% of the poverty line. The bottom line are the low-income students. And you can see as you go from left to right, we're going from low poverty schools to higher poverty schools. And low-income students who are in lower poverty schools are 20 points ahead of low-income students stuck in high poverty schools. And those 20 points, roughly speaking, represent about 2 years of learning. So in fourth grade, low-income students in low poverty schools are 2 years ahead of low-income students in high poverty schools. Now, part of that might be self-selection, right? The families, the low-income families who end up in middle-class schools might have something, might put a particularly high value on education. But Heather Schwartz at the RAND Corporation did a really interesting analysis of Montgomery County schools that looked at random assignment of students to public housing in different parts of Montgomery County. So many of you may be familiar with this jurisdiction. It's right outside of Washington, D.C. It has very wealthy parts. It has places of concentrated poverty as well. And Montgomery County does two things it's a very liberal jurisdiction. It does two things for low-income kids. The first is to spend extra money on students in higher poverty schools. The schools where there are higher concentrations of poverty get about $2,000 per pupil extra to invest in things that have been proven by research to be valuable, things like reduced class size in the early grades, better professional development for teachers, extended learning time. At the same time, Montgomery County has what's known as an inclusionary zoning program, whereby low-income families who live in public housing are given the opportunity to live in more affluent areas. So poor families in public housing in Montgomery County could be anywhere within the jurisdiction. And they're randomly assigned to public housing units. So this set up an interesting question. If you're a low-income student and you're randomly assigned to public housing, would you rather be in the school that has higher concentrations of poverty and spends $2,000 more per pupil, or would you rather be in a lower poverty school that spends substantially less? And Schwartz found that over time, the kids in the green zone schools, the more affluent schools, did quite a bit better than low-income students in higher poverty schools that spend more per pupil. The effect wasn't immediate, but over time, there was an enormous difference. In the language that she used, she found 0.4 of a standard deviation, which is better performance, which is a very large effect size in education circles where kind of 0.1 of a standard deviation is considered a modestly successful intervention. So why do students do better in middle-class schools? Well, part of it has to do with peer effects. Every parent knows that individual students are likely to be affected by their peers, and the research strongly backs up this concept. And you think about students in high poverty schools, if you're a low income student who gets to go to a middle class school instead of a high poverty school, you're likely to be in an environment where there are lower levels of teacher disrespect, where there is less mobility of students, so fewer students moving in and out of the classroom during the year, which has a positive effect on achievement. And you're likely to be around students who have higher incoming levels of academic achievement. So to take one example, we know that middle-class kids have much larger vocabularies than low-income kids on average. And so a low-income child who gets to go to a middle-class school is surrounded by students with larger vocabularies, and on the playground and in the classroom are able to benefit from that. Over time, however, we shifted away from this research-based approach that Al Shanker had envisioned. In charter schools, there's less teacher voice, not more teacher voice, as Al Shanker argued for. Only 7% of charter schools are unionized, for example, compared to the vast majority of teachers in the regular public schools. Charter schools have twice the turnover rate among teachers that traditional public schools have. So 24% of teachers leave every year in charter schools as compared to only 12% in traditional public schools. Now, part of that is because teachers are younger in charter schools. They're more likely to teach in high poverty neighborhoods. But when you control for those different effects, there's something real here about the charter school structure, which leads to higher turnover. So the gap, most of the gap remains even after you factor in those other issues. Charter schools are reported to have tougher working conditions than traditional public schools. So teachers teach longer hours, have poor benefits, and have lower yearly raises. So that's the bargain, right? Yeah, if you go to a charter school, you work more and you get less. And some charter school advocates kind of pride themselves on this. Well, we get really dedicated teachers, but one has to ask how sustainable this is in the long term. Charter school teachers report higher levels of dissatisfaction, and that's the main reason that they're leaving these schools. The other thing to note is that while Al Shanker envisioned charter schools as a place which would bring kids of different backgrounds together, in fact, most charter schools have higher levels of racial and economic isolation than traditional public schools. So charter schools are more likely to have a majority of low-income students. Even within urban districts, when you compare charter schools with traditional public schools, there are higher levels of racial isolation. So more than half of charter school students are in schools with 90 to 100% minority populations. If you look at African American students in particular, it's really quite striking. 70% of black students in charter schools are in schools that are 90 to 100% minority. So one has to ask whether that's a good thing for our society. 43% are in, what some would call apartheid schools, 99% minority. Now, let me pause and say, now that I threw out that inflammatory term, this is very different than segregation in the South. It's by choice. There is not the same level of compulsion, but there are nevertheless reasons that all of us should be concerned about racial and economic isolation. My final slide has to do with the current levels of performance in charter schools. If charter schools were beating the pants off traditional public schools, then all these complaints about reduced teacher voice and increased segregation might be tolerable. But we know from Mackie Raymond's research that while there are great charter schools, there are also terrible charter schools, and on average, charter schools perform about the way that traditional public schools perform. So now that I've depressed you, I will turn it over to Halley, who will share the good news about some terrific charter schools.
So I'm going to move some things pretty quickly, and I hope that you'll ask a lot of questions during our Q&A. So Rick talked about the reasons why we think it makes sense to promote more teacher voice and diversity in charter schools. I want to give you a quick overview of the schools that we profiled in the book and what we were looking for. So we profiled 15 different schools in a Smarter Charter that have strong systems for teacher voice, that integrate students, or in a few cases, schools that do both. And we were really looking for an existence proof. We wanted to tell case study stories about schools that are really embodying this vision and have strong results. This is something we've seen done with other charter networks, often with high poverty and non-unionized charter networks, and we wanted to tell a story about these charters that fit a different sort of mold. These areas, and you could possibly get voice through a different mechanism, but a teacher union can be a really effective tool for promoting voice in a number of different areas. These were schools that often had innovative union models, doing things that you might not typically see in a normal district union sort of relationship. One example of a reform like this is a thin contract that's much shorter than what you would see in a typical district contract. We also looked at teacher co-ops, which is a model where the charter school is actually run by teachers. So they're sharing the administrative duties that would normally be given to a principal or other administrator. And we looked at other mechanisms that charters had to really write teacher influence into their governance. So one example is schools that have teacher representation on their board of governors. And here you can see the governance arch for City Neighbors Charter School, a school in Baltimore, where in fact not only do they have teacher representation, but they have a student representative on their board too, which is pretty unusual. And both are full voting members of the board, and so really have a say in school decisions. And then the other main focus that we were looking for in charter schools were schools that are integrating students. And so just as we did with teacher voice, we had to first look at what we wanted to decide our parameters for an integrated school for these case studies. And so for socioeconomic diversity, we looked at schools that were roughly within a 20 percentage point range of a 50% low income, 50% middle class mix. And in racial and ethnic diversity, we looked for schools where there was diversity across a number of different racial and ethnic groups, mirroring our national demographics, in which this is the first year that public school students in the United States are a majority students of color. There's no one single racial or ethnic group that has a majority. And so this is a snapshot that shows you 6 of the different schools we profiled, and of the schools that we feature in the book, there is no more than 60% of the population represented by any one racial or ethnic group. And so with respect to these schools that are intentionally diverse, we looked at what types of tools these schools use to create these diverse student bodies. And location is one key component. Blackstone Valley Prep in Rhode Island is an example of a school that has used a regional approach to location to enroll a diverse student body. The school serves 4 different communities in Rhode Island, 2 higher income suburban communities, 2 lower income urban communities. Individually, those communities are not known for their diversity, but by having a regional model and picking an area where these communities are located next to each other, Blackstone Valley Prep is able to serve a socioeconomically and racially diverse group of students. We also looked at the methods that these schools had for targeting their recruitment and building a diverse lottery pool. So Larchmont Charter School in Los Angeles is an example of a school that's very thoughtful about that. They try to mirror the demographics of their neighborhood, which is a really diverse neighborhood in Los Angeles, but where the public schools typically are not diverse, largely because many middle-class families in that area are opting for private schools. So they set this target based on census data. They have a recruitment plan for where they're going to partner with community groups, and then every month they're reviewing what their lottery applications look like and using that data to adjust their strategies and recruit underrepresented groups. A number of these schools also used weighted admissions based on income, reserving seats for low-income students, based on geography, either reserving seats for students from public housing or getting an even distribution of students from across the area. And sometimes schools did a combination of this. And I'm going to skip ahead to just give you a broad overview of academic achievement. So we were looking for schools that showed success and wanted to tell these case study stories. So just to give you a sample of a few of the achievements that these schools had. So DSST Public Schools in Denver operates 9 out of the 10 top secondary schools in Denver. E.L. Haynes Public Charter School has won 3 awards for urban schools showing greatest achievement gains. Green Dot Public Schools has a graduation rate that is much higher than in neighboring schools. High Tech High Network, which is out in California, sends 98% of its graduates to college. And so this is really the bottom line. We think there's research that shows why teacher voice and integration are good strategies for promoting achievement, and these particular examples show that that can be successful in practice in a charter setting.
Thank you so much. Gerard Robinson shares one fate with me, and that is we're both recovering commissioners. Gerard actually has recovered twice, having done this in Virginia and Florida. I take my hat off to you. Once was enough for me. But I think that anyone who's been in that place, who's been responsible for millions of students, who has been showered with a variety of research, who's had to make these tough decisions every day, is someone we want to hear from. So, Gerard, please.
I should tell the dean we're also showered with many other things as well. First of all, let me thank the dean for extending to me an invitation to speak to you again in New York about charter schools. And why do I say again? I had an opportunity to walk today from the Roosevelt Hotel to the Roosevelt House. And on my walk, I passed 55th and Madison. Between 1995 and 97, I was a young, idealistic executive director who had moved to Jersey City, worked in New York to open a charter school. And I was fortunate in 1997 to be one of several people to shake the hand of then Governor Christine Todd Whitman for receiving a charter school. And most of the work took place here in New York. And I was excited about it in 1997, 2014, I'm equally excited about it. But what I find interesting is that my introduction to charters really began in 1993. Our 2 authors put together a very fine book, mentioned California in that research. And I know something about California because I actually worked in the legislature in 1993 when my boss, Senator Bill Leonard, we introduced a bill to amend California's charter law. And until that time, I had no idea what a charter school was. And there were 3 things on the table to consider when you want to open a charter school: the role of teachers, the role of race, and the role of innovation in impacting results. 2014, as Kahlenberg and Potter make us aware of, there are 3 ideas that we have to look at using the lens of Al Shanker: empowering teachers, reducing racial segregation, and the role of education through charter schools and what lessons can we learn in the traditional public school sector. And there are 3 things I like about the book. Number one is very few books that actually get to the ideological origins of a foundation. And so they use Shanker as a tool and they use that very well. Number two, they use 15 different schools. I can tell you it's rare to find a book that would do a survey approach and very clear about what their limitations and their expectations are in the study, but it's rare to get that. And I can say, wearing the hat of a social scientist, quality research matters a lot. Multiple case studies matter even more. And so they provide us great framework, particularly as a former authorizer and as an administrator at the state level responsible for charters. There are things they mention, for example, about where teachers matter that we could probably do a better job of including in our evaluation process for charter schools, but also in our application. Third, they spend a great deal of time talking about how charter schools can matter. 10 years ago, this discussion would have raised the question, do charter schools matter? They say, yes, it matters, but it matters in 3 areas. And so let's talk about teacher voice. You saw in an earlier slide 7 elements of charter school importance for teacher voice, and I think those things are great. The one thing I didn't see linked to those seven elements was their impact on student outcome and student achievement. Now, they're very clear. They've looked at research, and I can tell you there's a dearth of it out there, looking at the role of teacher unions and its impact on student achievement. The authors were clear that, at best, it shows some positive effects or no negative or no effects at all. And so it's mixed, and that's something that the researchers will say. But I would like to see a stronger correlation to results, because at the end of the day, looking at teachers and how it relates to curriculum, instruction, organizing, hiring, firing, staffing, dismissal, and salaries ultimately are linked to people who constitutionally are our students who have to be there. And so in student voice, it broadened my understanding. I'd love to see the link there. Racial isolation, I mean, that's something with Brown v. Board of Education being 60 that we still discuss. I'm clear about one thing. We do not have in 2014 segregated schools in the way we had segregated schools in 1954. If we say today that we have segregated schools, then we've said that 60 years of our work in public policy and law and in advocacy has been a failure. We have racially identifiable schools, absolutely. And that's not necessarily because arcane ideas about trying to keep one group to another or one group in an area. Yes, we know housing patterns and, let's say, mischief have played a role. But when I created a charter school and when I looked at evaluating charter schools, many of them were place-based, not race-based, meaning they were taking the kids they had. They weren't going to chase other kids to bring them in. And so I have to make sure that I understand we have racially identifiable schools. I won't call them segregated schools. I understand the apartheid piece in it is good for commentary, but America's much better than that today. And lastly, let's talk about the original founding fathers and mothers of the charter school movement. Al Shanker was surely one of them. Cologne was where he had maybe an epiphany to come forward. I would love to see, and I think there's rich ground, when he talked about empowering teachers, when he talked about desegregation of schools and innovation. Let's also take into account that when we look at charter schools, they have played an important role in shaping, A, the conversation of how public schools matter, not why they matter, but how they matter. Number two, the number of kids from charter schools who are going to college, who are graduating, whose parents have said, maybe I should re-enroll in school myself. So now it's having a family impact. Charter schools make a difference. Are they horrible charter schools? Absolutely. There's a book famous that many of you know, How to Win Friends and Influence People. You should write a book entitled How to Lose Friends and Influence No One. And that's written by someone who becomes a charter school authorizer. When I was an authorizer in Georgia at the state level, I denied 75% of the applications that came before me. I had people who called and said, Gerard, we thought you were a friend of charter schools. I said, I'm a friend of quality schools, charter, public, home, and otherwise. Number two, I don't want to approve a charter school that one of my 3 daughters can't attend. If it's not good enough for them, it shouldn't be good enough for someone else. And third, I had friends call friends of mine and say, we can't believe that Gerard would put a black eye on the movement. I said, no, this was never about charter schools only. This was about public schools now articulated as a charter school movement. In closing, I look forward to the dialogue. I think that this will be a healthy discussion. And again, Dean, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, everybody, and perhaps give you literally a minute or 2 minutes, let me be very generous, it's a nice day, to respond to some of those comments.
Yeah. I'll just say very quickly, thank you for your comments about the book. Very, very, very helpful thoughts there. One thing I'll focus on is the issue of racial isolation and particular economic isolation, because I think that's where we really, that's where the strongest nexus is to achievement. I agree with you that Gerard, that it's place-based in the sense that charter schools are drawing populations from where they decide to locate their schools. But my only thought on that is that where you choose to place your school is a conscious effort on the part of charter schools. And we, in the book, we talk about Blackstone Valley Prep that said, we don't want to just draw urban students or just suburban students. We're going to draw from a wide variety of backgrounds. And so I think that's something the charter school sector needs to think a little bit more about.
So let me push the following thought. I thought there were two books, actually, in this one book. One book was a very, very thoughtful treatment with deep portraits of some splendid schools that had chosen a particular model, a model, as you say, of conscious racial integration, a model of empowering teachers' voices. And for certain sectors of our community, those are, independently of any results, those are attractive on their face. And you told some very, very compelling stories about those schools. And that alone was clearly worth doing. We want to know about successful schools, and there's a very large literature on different kinds. The second book was a normative book that said, in not so many words, and often in so many words, charter schools should be more like this. And that's where you're going to get the pushback. Because surely, just as there are good schools who follow your model, you didn't actually give us a collective performance result for all schools like the ones you chose.
Right.
And that, I have to say, struck me as a weakness. You can't argue that there aren't other models of highly successful charter schools that are 99% minority, some of them very close to where we're sitting, who don't use that model. And so I wonder why am I right, first of all, that there are two books there? And are you really wanting to sustain the normative argument that this is just going to be a better model than, an Eva Moskowitz model or whatever else you might come up with?
Well, why don't you go ahead, Howard?
Yeah, so I think we want to shift in the direction of that model because we're so far from that now, where the needle is. We don't want to shut down successful schools that may not fit this model. We need successful schools doing different things. But right now, our charter movement is very focused on taking advantage of circumventing teacher unions and on an idea of really targeting niche populations. And there are also policies in place that are part of what's creating that current bias. So I think what we're arguing is that more charter schools need to be following this model, which partly means we need to change some of the policies in place to help encourage schools to do that. And then I think a healthier charter sector would include some schools that follow models that we're more familiar with, but many more schools that are using that charter flexibility to give teachers voice in ways that they don't have in district schools and to use that flexibility of enrollment to bring together diverse groups of students.
So, but let me push a point that Gerard, I thought, made very well, which is surely in the end this is about students. And as I read your book, one of the things I kept thinking about is this is an argument from an adult agenda. For example, no doubt it's unfortunate for adults if they find themselves turning over their profession a lot. Much of the criticism of Teach for America is that after 3 or 4 years, not many of them are left in the classrooms. Certainly in a number of charter schools, the turnover is very high, higher than in regular public schools. If you're a child and the teacher in front of you that year and each year is an outstanding teacher, why should we be complaining? Isn't that an adult agenda? Isn't the book an argument about between adults about other agendas? Is the point I'm trying to make.
I don't think so. I think the reason we are concerned about teacher turnover is that is connected to lower levels of student achievement. And we cite evidence in the book that when there are high levels of teacher turnover, students suffer. And so it's not simply the adult perspective, it's what are the consequences going to be for kids.
There we would have to become wonks. Some of the scholarship you cite in that is older scholarship, to be honest. And I think what would be said today is that the real division between high-performing charter schools and low-performing charter schools is much less about how long the teachers stay than A, the nature of the curriculum, B, the nature of the attention to detail. Most of the research that Mackie has done suggests, for example, that the reason New York charter schools are bimodal in their quality versus Boston, where they're far stronger, is actually because Boston is much stricter about authorizing only those schools in networks that have proven results, whereas New York has its share of mom and pop or fly-by-night schools.
Yeah.
So isn't it the case that actually this is a red herring, that in fact what we really know is that there are high-performing charter schools with very high turnover of teachers and very high minority enrollment, and weak charter schools with the same demographic, but they just do it differently?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Boston example is an interesting one that I think we should talk about a little bit more. So Boston schools, many of you may know, Boston charter schools are among the highest performing in the country. So people are trying to figure out what is it that the Boston schools are doing, the charter schools are doing that's different than what other schools are doing. And it turns out that the Boston school population, charter school population, is more advantaged than the traditional public school population. So some people use that to say, some of my friends on the far left would say, kind of gotcha, this isn't real. But Halley and I interpret that differently, that in a Boston charter school, you are surrounded by peers who are more likely to have higher levels of achievement, and that has a positive impact. I think KIPP is a great example of this as well. On the surface, KIPP is a school that is a high poverty school, high minority school. So it would seem to suggest, oh, segregation doesn't matter. Look at KIPP. Well, in fact, at a KIPP school, you have students who've self-selected into a rigorous curriculum. You have large numbers of kids leave KIPP schools. You have very little replacement of KIPP students. And so you have a very positive peer environment in a KIPP school. You have the survivors who have gone through the regimen and are still there. And to my mind, there's a huge lesson to learn from KIPP, and that is that we ought to give every child a chance to go to a school where they have a positive peer environment.
Do you want to intervene here?
I just wanted to say a point about the teacher turnover too. I think when you look at some highly successful charter networks that have high teacher turnover, it's a mistake to think that they're successful because of that. I think they're often successful in spite of that, or because they developed a model that can work with high teacher turnover. But when you look at the charter sector overall and the performance overall, which there are a number of schools that are not up to par, I think a lot of those other charter schools, you're seeing high teacher turnover that's a real challenge. And as you look at an organizational perspective, expanding some of these networks that have built tools to deal with high teacher turnover, you have to wonder about what that means from an organizational perspective. So the amount of resources that you're putting into constantly recruiting and training new teachers is an organizational drain. You can build a model that accounts for that, but how much more could you be doing if that was going into taking the teachers that you have and bringing them to the next level?
So a few points. One, I really wish that identifying a charter school in the city was as easy as we discussed here. A lot of charter schools are placed in cities based upon building availability, nothing else. In our former in Missouri, in fact, when I was president of BAO, we actually had to push hard to get the state to approve a regulation to allow underutilized school buildings to make them available for charter schools. It was a fight. It's a public school with a public mission and a public goal. And so finding schools, you may have wanted to go to maybe an affluent area. So building is a factor I would put in there. Number two, Boston's got great examples. High-performing schools like the one you mentioned. There are also high-performing, predominantly black and Hispanic schools there as well. But here's something we often overlook. Boston is rated one of the smartest cities in the nation, 250,000 college students, 40 colleges in the area, large graduate schools of education who've been there a long time. Love to see how we link graduate schools of education and preparation to this piece. And this is where your research pushed me to think differently, because as we're thinking about ed schools today, what role can teacher voice play? And even as an authorizer, how can I better evaluate how we look at that? So,
There's a claim here, which of course is very historically famous and runs very deep in American history, that is that regulation that produces either racially, however one wants to call it, segregated or racially distinct schools, that there's a negative impact on those students. You say it in the book. And you even sort of suggest that there are long-term effects in terms of citizenship qualities that are going to be damaged by this fact. Almost without exception, the research on private schools, the research on Catholic schools, for example, indicates that actually citizenship qualities, when controlled for income and race, because it's gotten quite sophisticated, the citizenship qualities, the likelihood of staying out of jail, any measure you wish, those students actually outperform their peers in the public schools. I'm just curious as to, and today, 2014, on what empirical grounds you're making what is, after all, a very, very incendiary argument, which doesn't mean it's wrong. But where is the empirical data, not from 50 years ago, not even from 20 years ago, but today, that the graduate of the 98% black but very well-run charter school is at some kind of long-term citizenship disadvantage?
Well, I mean, if you look at the Supreme Court's decision in 2007, in the parents involved case versus Seattle, there were, I think it was 500 social science researchers who documented the ways in which levels of prejudice are higher in segregated settings than in integrated settings. The student who is now consigned to a 98% African American school, to my mind, is particularly disadvantaged if it's also a 80-90% low income.
Right. So those are regular public schools. That data was based on regular public schools,
Yes.
not on the charter school sector.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
we
Well,
have
we
to
don't. Yeah, we don't have as much
Right.
information on the charter school
Almost
sector.
none.
But I mean, I think one would be hard pressed to make the argument that, in 2014, that we would prefer to have racially isolated and economically isolated schools, that's good for our society. I think it's that there's lots of evidence.
Well,
to
actually,
suggest-
there is argument about that. There are very, very dedicated educators who work with black male-only schools, claiming very importantly positive results because of powerful role models. And I mean, this is
Which is the argument, of course, that was made in Brown, right?
all right, but it's
by
not
the South.
It's not
That it was better.
1954.
That
right.
was better for these black students if they're in racially.
Right, but that's
and
built by
economically-
historical association. That
Yeah.
seems
No.
okay.
No. I mean, I think there's a social science consensus that segregation or racial isolation has negative effects on students. Part of it's academic, but part of it's that we want students, white students are damaged by isolation as well, that we want students who are going to get along with people of all different backgrounds. I mean, the number one reason that people are fired on the job is not they're incompetent, it's that they can't get along with people who are different than themselves. So I think, I feel like we're on pretty strong grounds to suggest that all other things being equal, it's better to have our schools racially and economically integrated than isolated.
I agree that it's better to have that happen, and as we progress toward that goal, we have to educate the students we have where they are. There are two factors to look at. Brookings Institute, in their Metropolitan Studies Center, identify African Americans and Asians as being the two groups with the highest concentration of living in cities, particularly central cities. That's where your schools are. Arne Duncan opened up this year, going to a point you made, for the first time in American history, majority of the students are Hispanic or Black, so you're going to see a very different change. I still stand by the point that the 500 social scientists that he agreed with is a quantitative argument. I still question the qualitative aspect of it, particularly since they're going back to arguments that supported the Brown decision to make sure that that took place and then moving forward in the 60s. I support integrated environments. I also support that we don't denigrate, maybe not facetiously, the idea that anything that's not all white is bad, or anything that's all Black by default can't be exceptional. You look at your Black colleges who for many decades absorbed most of your Black kids from Black schools, which helped create your Black middle class. Now, you have majority of your Black kids today who don't go to Black schools. So that part is moving forward, but again, I just don't buy the piece that you can't have excellence. And I also agreed about the economic
and
argument.
I want to agree with that the argument in the book is not that if a school is quote unquote too Black, it's problematic in terms of the academic achievement of those students. Going back for many, many years, the research has always suggested it was the economic mix that drives academic achievement much more than the racial mix. And I get in trouble with my friends in the civil rights community for pointing that out. Right. But school integration raised the scores of Black students, not because there was something special about the whiteness of the skin of the classmates. It was that the white students, on average, were more economically advantaged, and that there are advantages to being in economically mixed schools in terms of academic achievement. So
the point that also comes with that is they had better quality teachers.
Right.
So if the better quality teacher was the factor and it wasn't the phenotype of the student, then give me better quality teachers, and then maybe we could.
Right. I mean, just to give you the data and disclosure, I was some years ago on Eva's board, so let's say that. But she has more applicants for teaching positions than any other school in the United States, so far as I'm aware. I mean, it's in the tens of thousands. And so whatever it is that's happening there isn't discouraging that fact. I think but let me, since I mentioned, we'll get to questions in a second. Since I mentioned Eva, let's get to New York City. It may be in Rhode Island is Rhode Island. We have 1.1 million school children here. And we have real geographic locations. Let's take your thesis and talk about how it would actually apply for the students in Harlem, the students in the South Bronx, the students in the North Bronx. Is a charter operator hoping to serve the 50,000 families on waiting lists, almost all of whom are minority families? Are we supposed to say there should be a quota to insist that there be 30% white students in that school?
Well, that would be illegal. I mean, you can't do it based on race, but you can do it based on class. Go ahead.
But I mean, talk reality, talk New York.
Yeah, I think New York City is a great example.
Good.
Because it's a metro area where you have opportunities and also limitations based on their residential segregation. Right. But New York Appleseed did an analysis recently where they looked at each of the community school districts in New York City, and in about half of them, their demographics within that school district would provide an opportunity for much more integrated schools than what's currently there. Now that means half of them there's so much racial and economic residential segregation that you can't achieve it, but the half still have many opportunities. And so, as New York City is authorizing new charter schools, what if a whole set of those were set for those districts and really intentional about their recruitment, reaching out to families of different socioeconomic and racial backgrounds and built that into their model? I think that would be a really positive step for families of all different backgrounds in those areas.
Let me just say, having attended a meeting yesterday at the Charter School Center devoted to increasing the percentage of ELL students, and having missed another event devoted to increasing the percentage of special education students, one begins to feel a little sorry for the charter school operators who seem to be asked to do everything for our population's And I'll leave it at that and turn it to the audience. Peter.
My name is Peter Goodman. I write a blog called Ed and the Apple. Let's get back to the beginning. Al Shanker's vision was that charter schools should be laboratories for innovation. Are they? Do public schools have anything to learn from charter schools?
Good.
I think there's a lot to learn from charter schools, and as I think sometimes the charter schools could learn from the traditional public schools. I mean, if you look at KIPP, and if you look at Success Academies, there are things that are being done in the classroom that are relevant to the public schools. So the extended learning time, which is expensive, by the way, but that's something that seems to have a positive effect. I think the peer effects issue is huge. I mean, part of the reason that Success Academy does well is that it appears is that they do not allow new kids to come in to their school after a certain grade. Now, that won't work for the traditional public schools, taken literally. But the idea that in these schools they create a special peer environment is something that we could replicate by creating more economically mixed schools in the traditional public school system.
Yes, at the back.
Thank you. Just working backwards, David just said that we're asking the charter schools to do a lot, but the regular public schools have to do that all the time. They have to take all of those different types of students. And on the issue of the segregation in the city by income, this is written into legislation that Title I schools have to have a certain percentage in order to qualify for Title I funding. So there's an incentive. My classic example is PS 199 and 191 over on the far west side. A few blocks apart, completely different profiles. Now, if they could just take the children without having to worry about those percentages, then they would be totally integrated schools in all probability. Which brings me to the schools that you have profiled. I couldn't help but think this is exactly how the magnet schools work. And which then brings me to, why do we need the charter schools?
Okay, that's the question. Thank you.
Well, I think we, the magnet model is a strong one, and particularly looking at the schools we profiled that prioritize diversity, they're doing a lot of things that magnet schools do. Magnet schools are still usually in a relationship with the district, though, and there is something about the idea that charter schools are autonomous schools that are given this great exchange of flexibility for accountability. And I think you do see innovation there that you might not see in a magnet school that has more restrictions based on its relationship with the district. So I think they're both strong models, but that gets at the root of what separates a charter school based on that governance model. And it does mean that you can have a group of parents or educators come together and start a school, and that's something that you can't do with a typical magnet model.
Go ahead. Mike is coming.
So my name is Jim DeVore. I was a former president of Community Education Council for District 15 and suffered through the trenches with Eva. And as a high school parent looking at high schools, I'm just surprised at some of my empirical base is very different from yours, Dr. Steiner. I look, for example, the mayor of New York and the chancellor of the New York City Board of Education were very much in your camp about the idea that racial segregation really doesn't matter if we can have high quality schools over there for those folks and high quality schools over there for those folks. Reality is it's just, when that happens, white folks win. I'll give you an example down the street from here. Compare Baruch High School to Manhattan Village Academy. Both of those are elite school, considered elite schools. One's 90% black, one is about 10%. If you look by any measure, Baruch High School is a more successful school. I don't think that it's a coincidence, even though Manhattan Village Academy is one that the chancellor used to go to every other year to show what a wonderful school it was. They are literally 5 blocks apart. In just in terms of, compare District 2 high schools with District 13 high schools, it's outside of tech.
Can I? Yeah.
You'll find the same kind of issue, which we've seen before.
So very quickly, just a clarification, no one would suggest that the regular public schools in high poverty neighborhoods in New York City are coming close to the performance of... No, wait. I was talking about charter schools, so let's be very clear. The point of many of the charter schools that I know is precisely because of the data that you are talking about. It is precisely to raise the performance of students in high poverty neighborhoods that those charter schools exist. And some of those charter schools do precisely that. I don't think there's any doubt among the empirical researchers of that fact. The question is, in New York City, would a model of the kind that you are describing, given the huge pent-up demand for places by minority parents for charter schools, would it even be politically feasible to say, look, the next charter schools can't serve, 90% African American or Hispanic students because we've decided that they have to be racially integrated?
Well, that isn't what we argue in the book. We don't talk for, we don't advocate closing schools or not authorizing schools that have a certain racial balance. 95% of education reform is about trying to make separate but equal work. That's where all the discussion is. Okay, how can we improve these schools? And we're just saying that some of the discussion should also be about how to create economically and racially integrated schools, given that there's this strong body of research to suggest that that will be good for kids.
Great. Other voices? Yes, please.
I'm wondering what statutory and regulatory criteria might be put on charter authorization. I mean, I didn't see any model charters in Arizona, So how can we improve charter schools while maintaining their pluralism,
Yes.
but achieving public social goals?
That's a very good question.
Well, I'll say,
Please.
I loved your line about being an authorizer, Gerard, but there is a lot that authorizers could do in terms of asking hard questions about student diversity in charter schools at the charter application process already, requiring that charter schools have an affirmative diversity plan, which is not to say that all charter schools have to meet our criteria of being integrated, but should be thoughtful about what they are expecting their enrollment to be, why that's part of their educational plan, how they're going to reach out to English language learners and special education students. And similarly with teacher voice, should be asking some tough questions at the beginning before a charter school is authorized in terms of what is the plan for how teachers at your school are going to be recruited? Is there any sort of a career path? What role will they play in school decisions? So I think there is a huge role for authorizers to ask some of those really hard questions.
Sure.
At a local level, we can talk about Milwaukee. I was one of the schools in your study was mentioned. Milwaukee has an authorizer for the school board, one for the Common Council, one for the community college, but haven't done much with that, and one for the university. Being in a city with multiple authorizers did two things. Number one, it made those who wanted to open a charter school, give them a chance to pick and choose. If you go to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, your kids will have access to certain research if you go to the independent. So it made all the authorizers better because they now had to actually, I know we don't like using this word, compete. Unless it's on Friday or playing basketball, then compete's okay. To compete against kids, it made everyone's application better. A great white paper is to look at the authorization, charter school application in 2000 and compare it to today. They've just evolved over the year. At the state level, the National Alliance for Charter School Authorizers has put out some really good research on what matters. And there are, in fact, questions in most of the states I've worked in looking at how are you going to have race, socioeconomic diversity in place if you have it. But there are also at least 13 states that have a desegregation clause in their state charters. 3 of those were some of the first that came on point between 1991 and 1997.
Go ahead.
Okay, you spoke a lot about diversity. What I don't see, and I'm an actual teacher now, and I'm in the charter, and I was previously in another charter last year that just broke my heart. I'm certified in physics. Right now I'm teaching math. I switched over simply because I went running And I felt really bad for my children. I'm born and raised in the South Bronx. I'm still in the Bronx. There's no teacher diversity. There's none. To about feeling uncomfortable and being around people that were so out of touch with the reality of the kids. You talked about the middle school. I grew up around there. My mother's still there, and we know Eagle. And it's still probably worse than it was back and forth, hearing stories left and right. And I'm in the North Bronx now, but it's still just out of touch. I mean, they came from Long Island. They came in. They aren't going to see the kids. And honestly, I felt a lot of them was running for their lives as well. You talk about high teacher turnover rates because you have administration that's out of touch. It's just hard. Then you see 70% Black and Latinos are in the school system. How could you talk about integration or class or anything? I literally had kids who told me, and they're going to have a different conversation with me, obviously. And it's like, listen, I've never went to school with a white person. I mean, it's just, in administration being out of touch, you in the Latino community, you said you've been in education 20 or 30 years, and you don't speak Spanish? How?
So I'll say very quickly, and then I want to hear other people. One of the deepest challenges I face as dean of a very large school of education, we have about 3,000 students learning to be teachers and principals, is trying to encourage minorities to come to the school, to become teachers. Right. No, I agree. This is a vicious cycle. It's a vicious circle. But we have other deans and past deans in the audience. It is a national problem. We have got a group that is 90% women, white women. Right? And that's not untypical. And in fact, the great irony was that we have a small cohort of Teach for America. And, I would just be public about this. It was the most diverse group of teachers we have of any cohort, because TFA is making a very aggressive effort to raise the number of minority teachers. So I would just say that this is a national problem. It goes to the working conditions of teachers, the salaries of teachers. When you are an incredible rarity. That is somebody who's obviously talented in science and math, who has stuck it out, been a teacher at the high level, and we have so few. I mean, I think this is not untypical, frankly, of schools of education across the country. It's a major crisis. But the idea of an integrated teacher force, as you rightly point out, is every bit as challenging. Any other thoughts? One over there.
Thank you for those nice words about TFA. I'm Susan Salter with Teach for America, and just curious about the connection that you see with community engagement as well, and what the research might show about the positive benefits of having a school that's deeply embedded in its community, and therefore perhaps reflective of that community, and knowing what we do about racial and economic segregation in our communities, whether there's actually an advantage though in having that strong connection with the community in the school.
I think there's always been this tension in public education between neighborhood schools and integrated schools. We're fortunate now that there are more places that are both, where if you draw from the neighborhood, you can create a racially and economically integrated environment. Sometimes it requires a fair amount of intentionality, though. One of the schools that we profile is a Community Roots Charter School in Brooklyn, and they found that over time they were becoming increasingly popular among white middle-class families, and we're going to lose the diversity. And so they said, we're going to set aside 40% of the seats for a nearby public housing project, and that has enabled a rich economic and racial diversity to survive and flourish in a school that doesn't draw exclusively from a particular neighborhood, but is able to be rooted in the community.
And I'll say one other thing about Community Roots. They're an example of a school, and a number of schools that we profiled were very intentional then about building community within a school that doesn't have a particular neighborhood chunk in the district. I mean, there's still a district priority in New York City, so their kids are coming from the district in which they're located, which, from a suburban perspective is not really all that far apart, but they aren't necessarily likely to see each other outside of school. And so the school has been very intentional about setting up programs to do that, and also doing that in a way that assigns students to play great groups together with students from other backgrounds that they are not likely otherwise to come across outside of school hours.
Last thoughts, Jim?
So community engagement, here's a practical example. In St. Louis, previous life president of the Black Alliance for Educational Options, our state director had done a lot of outreach going to homes. She was able to have 1,000 students leave St. Louis public schools and go to charter schools. Overnight, the superintendent and some of the leadership said, what do we need to do differently? She actually partnered with them and tried to find a way of actually getting more parental engagement in the traditional public school systems. So that was one way that community engagement works. Number two, the part about racial integration in some areas is going to be tough. Some say that we don't want to do any more because it's going to lead to white flight. The reality is the whites who wanted to fly have flown. What we also need to talk about is the black exodus. The black middle-class residents who've left the city for the same reasons the whites did, minus one or two things. We haven't integrated that aspect too. So there's something we as a community also have to look at when we talk about economic integration. I still take this stand. I'm going to educate you at the place that we have while others focus on race. I'm focused on place.
So I want to say a deep thank you to our guests. It's obviously my role to push on wherever the positions are, but I want to say again that this is a book that is deeply worth reading. When it's attacked from all sides, it says to me, they're onto something. That's a kind of litmus test for me. I think that these are very difficult conversations, and I have always believed that the reason this institute exists is to have those conversations. Where else, right? We are a great public university. We serve almost 500,000 students of every kind. At Hunter, we have over 80 languages spoken. And the questions that we have raised today go even beyond, I think, the question of charter schools, but to the very nature of democratic education and what does it really mean in 2014. So I want to thank everybody here on the panel and thank you all for coming very much.